The North Atlantic does not negotiate. It is a place of absolute freezing indifference. Here, the water is as hard as concrete, and the wind carries the razor-edged chill of the Arctic ice shelf. It does not care about the fragile machinery of men, nor the empires they claim to serve. On the morning of the 8th of April, 1940, the Norwegian sea was convulsing. A violent northwesterly gale was tearing the tops off the waves, creating a chaotic topography of grey valleys and white-capped peaks. In the centre of this maelstrom, a solitary ship was dying. She was His Majesty's ship Glowworm, G-class destroyer, a greyhound of the ocean, designed for speed, for hunting submarines, for screening the fleet. She carried 149 souls. They were mostly young reservists, boys from Liverpool, London and Portsmouth who had left shop counters and factories to serve. They were trained to drop depth charges, not to stand toe-to-toe with a giant. And yet, there she was. Her bridge was smashed into a tangle of twisted iron. Her hull was perforated, bleeding oil and black smoke into the gale. She was ablaze from stem to stern, rolling heavily in the swell, her decks awash with freezing water and fire. A heavy shell had severed her mast, dropping it across the siren wires. For the last 20 minutes of her existence, the Glowworm did not fight in silence. She fought under the ear-splitting continuous wail of her own jammed siren, a mechanical banshee scream rising above the roar of the cannons and the howling wind. She was burning. She was sinking. She was utterly alone. And she was charging. Facing her was a Leviathan, the German heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, a floating fortress of hardened Krupp armour, displacing 14,000 tons to the Glowworm's 1,300. By every metric of naval warfare, by every rational calculation of survival, the Glowworm was dead. She should have turned away. She should have struck her colours. But the Glowworm did not turn. With her captain dead on his feet, bleeding from multiple wounds, she throttled up. She turned her shattered bow directly toward the towering steel wall of the enemy. This is not a story of victory in the traditional sense. It is a story of the refusal to yield. To understand the end, we must look back 2 days, to a decision that defines the terrible burden of command. It was the spring of 1940. The phony war was ending. The chessboard of Europe was being reset. The British Admiralty, desperate to cut off the flow of Swedish iron ore to the Nazi war machine, had launched Operation Wilfred, a mission to mine Norwegian waters. HMS Glowworm was part of the screen, a protective detail for the massive battlecruiser HMS Renown. The weather on the night of April 6th was atrocious. The fleet was battered by a Force 8 gale. Destroyers are lively ships. In heavy weather they corkscrew violently. In the pre-dawn darkness, a rogue wave, a wall of water appearing out of the blackness, swept the deck of the Glowworm. In an instant, a man was washed overboard. In the strict cold calculus of fleet operations, the fleet must not stop. To stop is to lose formation. To stop is to become a stationary target for U-boats prowling the deep. The standard order is to steam on. But the captain of the Glowworm was Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roope. Roope was 35. He had a wife and a young son waiting for him in England. He was not a firebrand or a glory hunter. His crew knew him as a destroyer man of the old school, quiet, pipe-smoking, possessing a steady fatherly competence. He was the sort of officer who calmed the stomach-churning anxiety of his young sailors simply by standing on the bridge. He knew the risks, but he could not leave a man behind in that freezing black water without trying. He signalled the flagship. He requested permission to detach, to turn back into the teeth of the storm and search. Permission was granted. For hours the Glowworm circled in the heaving seas. Every eye on the bridge strained against the greyness, looking for a bobbing head. But the Atlantic is too big, and a human life is too small. Heavy-hearted, Roope was eventually forced to call off the rescue and turn about to rejoin the Renown. But that act of compassion had a fatal cost. While the Glowworm had been searching for one lost soul, the British fleet had moved far ahead. A gap of 60 miles had opened up. Into that gap, the German Navy had slipped. This was not a random patrol. It was the spearhead of Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Norway. The Glowworm was now steaming north, blind, alone, her gyro compass shattered by the storm, sailing directly into the jaw of the trap. Dawn broke on the 8th of April with a thick, hanging fog that clung to the water. Shortly before 8 a.m, the lookouts on the Glowworm stiffened, shapes on the horizon, dark silhouettes cutting through the mist. Roope identified them immediately. 2 German destroyers, the Bernd von Arnim and the Hans Ludemann. The odds were already 2-1, but Roope was aggressive. He engaged immediately. The Glowworm opened fire, her forward guns cracking in the morning air. But the German ships acted strangely. They were heavily armed, yet they did not close to fight. They turned tail and fled into the mist. It looked like a retreat. It was, in fact, a lure. These German destroyers were not hunting. They were carrying troops. Their decks were packed with mountain infantry destined for the seizure of Trondheim. They were heavy, sluggish, and terrified of a lucky British shell hitting their crowded decks. So they ran, signalling frantically to their heavy escort lurking just over the horizon. The trap was sprung, but the real nightmare was still hidden in the fog. Then the mist tore open. Emerging from a squall line to the north was the Admiral Hipper. The difference in scale was grotesque. The Glowworm displaced 1,350 tons. The Hipper displaced 14,000. On the bridge of the Glowworm, men were struggling to stand against the violent pitching of the ship, peering through salt-sprayed binoculars. By contrast, the bridge of the Admiral Hipper was a place of calm, clinical efficiency. The German officers were dry, they were stable, and they possessed a technological terror the British lacked: radar-controlled gunnery. Deep inside the German cruiser, in a warm plotting room, gunnery officers weren't guessing. They were watching a blip on a screen, calculating the range with mathematical precision. Roope knew his ship was doomed, but he also knew the Admiralty did not know this German force was at sea. He had to report the enemy position. He had to buy time for the fleet. He turned to his helmsman. His voice was level. "Steer course 090. We engage." The engagement was short, brutal, and one-sided. Roope turned his small ship broadside to the giant. "Open fire." The Glowworm shuddered as her guns spoke. But moments later the Hipper replied. The first German salvo landed short, throwing up columns of water that drenched the Glowworm's bridge. The second salvo did not miss. An 8-inch shell slammed into the Glowworm. It didn't just damage the ship, it gutted it. The medical station was obliterated. The radio room was turned into a smoking ruin of sparks and twisted metal, though the operators managed to tap out one final partial warning before their equipment disintegrated. Then, the bridge was hit. Roope was knocked off his feet, shrapnel tearing into his thigh. He dragged himself up, gripping the binnacle for support, his white uniform stained dark. "Close the range," he ordered. The distance dropped. 8,000 yards, 6,000 yards. A shell toppled the mast, crushing the galley and shorting the siren wires. The scream began. On the Hipper, Captain Helmuth Heye watched the burning destroyer with a mixture of annoyance and confusion. This should have been over in minutes. He had the superior firepower. He had the range. But this little British ship refused to die. "Why is he not sinking?" Heye reportedly muttered to his executive officer. "Why is he still firing?" He kept his bow pointed at the Glowworm, presenting a narrow target, while his massive forward turrets picked the destroyer apart piece by piece. The Glowworm was listing heavily to starboard. She was slowing down. Her guns were falling silent. Roope checked the bearing. The Hipper was turning slightly, trying to bring her full broadside to bear for the kill shot. Roope had one card left, a gambler's throw. "Make smoke!" Thick, oily black smoke belched from the glowworm's funnels. Roope steered his ship into the cloud, wrapping herself in a shroud of artificial darkness. On the bridge of the Admiral Hipper, Captain Heye hesitated. The Englishman was finally fleeing. It was the sensible thing to do. Heye ordered his helm to follow the destroyer into the smoke, trusting his radar to find the target in the gloom. He would hunt the rat in its hole and finish it. But inside that blinding cloud, where the air was unbreathable and visibility was zero, Roope was not retreating. He was doing the arithmetic of survival. He watched the magnetic compass swinging. He calculated the enemy's speed. He waited, sweat mixing with the blood on his face. Harder starboard. The glowworm heeled over violently. Her propellers churned the dark water. She wasn't running away. She was turning back. She was becoming a missile. Suddenly the glowworm burst out of her own smokescreen. The range was point blank, less than 400 yards. On the German bridge, the atmosphere of clinical detachment evaporated instantly. Lookouts screamed warnings. Officers scrambled for handrails. The massive grey shape of the destroyer was rushing at them, growing larger by the second, filling the entire view of the bridge windows. "Harder port! Full astern!" Heye screamed. The massive Hipper tried to turn. Her engines roared in reverse, the water boiling at her stern as she tried to arrest her momentum. But physics is a cruel mistress. A 14,000-ton cruiser carries immense inertia. She could not stop. She drifted sluggishly, exposing her vulnerable starboard side. Roope held his course. There was no gunfire now, just the roar of the engines and the scream of the siren. "Stand by for collision." The glowworm slammed into the Hipper. The destroyer's bow crumpled like foil. But the sheer kinetic force of the impact drove her into the cruiser's side, just aft of the anchor. The glowworm tore a 100-foot gash in the German armoured belt. She ripped open the torpedo tubes. She punched a hole into the storage compartments, flooding the German ship with 500 tons of freezing water. For a moment the two ships were locked together, the tiny, broken destroyer pinned against the flank of the giant in a deadly embrace. Then the glowworm fell away. She drifted down the side of the Hipper, her bow missing, her fires raging. And in a final act of defiance, Petty Officer Walter Townley, manning the single remaining operational gun, swung his barrel around. He fired. The shell struck home at point-blank range, burying itself in the German superstructure. The end came quickly. The glowworm capsized to starboard. Her boilers exploded as the cold sea hit the superheated metal. She slid beneath the waves. The siren finally stopped. On the Hipper, Captain Heye looked down at the oil-stained water. He was a Prussian officer of the old school, stern, rigid, but bound by a code of honour. He was visibly shaken. He knew he had just witnessed an act of bravery that transcended the uniform. He made a decision that terrified his own crew. He ordered his ship to stop. This was madness. They were in enemy waters. The sea was likely swarming with British submarines. To stop a heavy cruiser dead in the water was to paint a target on their own backs. His officers scanned the waves anxiously for periscopes, but Heye refused to leave. For over an hour, the German crew threw ropes and cargo nets over the side. They hauled 38 freezing, oil-soaked survivors onto their deck. They found Lieutenant Commander Roope in the water. He was exhausted. He had spent his last reserves of strength helping his young reservists find life jackets, pushing them toward the ropes, shouting encouragement. When the rope finally came for him, he reached out, but the cold had done its work. His frozen, oil-slicked fingers could not hold the purchase. He slipped away. A wave washed over him, and he vanished into the deep. The Hipper limped into Trondheim. But the glowworm had extracted her pound of flesh. The damage was severe. The torn hull and flooded compartments forced the Hipper back to Germany for dry dock repairs, taking her out of the war for weeks. Roope had not only fought, he had removed a capital ship from the board at a critical moment in history. But the story does not end there. Weeks later, a letter arrived at the British Admiralty in London. It had travelled via the International Red Cross, crossing the battle lines of a world at war. It was written by Captain Helmuth Heye. In the letter, Heye eulogized his enemy. He wrote of a man who fought a superior force with lion-hearted courage, a man who engaged to save his fleet and who fought his ship until the very planks beneath his feet were gone. Heye concluded with a formal request. He recommended that the British government award Lieutenant Commander Gerard Roope a decoration for valour. It was a request without precedent, but the evidence was undeniable. Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roope was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award for valour in the British Empire. He was the first VC recipient of the Second World War, and the only one in history to be awarded on the recommendation of the enemy who killed him. The Glowworm lies at the bottom of the Norwegian Sea today. The steel has rusted away. The names of her crew are etched on stone memorials in quiet towns across England. But the legacy of that morning remains. It is a reminder that even in the industrial slaughter of total war, there remains a capacity for honour. That courage can be recognised across the sights of a gun, and it poses a question to us all. When the gyro is broken, when the fog is thick, and when the enemy is a giant, do we run, or do we turn into the smoke? Commander Roope and his crew taught the world that victory isn't always about who sails away. Sometimes victory is simply the refusal to yield. To understand the terror of the thunderclap, you must first understand the silence that preceded it. For the pilots of the Royal Air Force, the air war over Europe had a specific sound, one they had curated since the Battle of Britain. It was the sound of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, a liquid-cooled V12 engine that didn't just run, it sang. To the British ear it was a refined mechanical symphony, a whistle, a smooth purr, the sound of a fencing foil cutting through the air. It was elegant, precise, and distinctly European. The RAF pilots of 1943 viewed the sky as a dueling ground. They flew Spitfires that fit like tailored suits. They valued maneuverability, climb rates, and the ability to turn inside an opponent. They believed in the philosophy of the knife fight in a phone booth. Then, the Americans arrived, and they brought a machine that didn't just break the rules of aerodynamics, it offended the British sense of propriety. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt did not whine, it roared. When the 4th Fighter Group arrived in England, British pilots gathered to inspect the new American machines and were initially appalled. To the veteran RAF aces, the P-47 was a caricature of an airplane. It was barrel-shaped, massive, and seemingly too heavy to fly. They called it a dinosaur, but it was the sound that confused them most. The engine was an air-cooled radial, the Pratt & Whitney R2-800 Double Wasp. It didn't hum, it hammered. It sounded like a piece of heavy industrial machinery, a locomotive tearing through the sky. British pilots joked that the Americans had sent flying milk bottles. They suggested, politely but firmly, that the US Army Air Force might want to reconsider their choice of mount. They quipped that the cockpit was so roomy, the best evasive maneuver was simply to unstrap yourself and run around inside it. They didn't understand that they were looking at the end of the gentleman's war. The British fought with rapiers. The Americans had brought a sledgehammer, and this sledgehammer was about to make a noise that would drown out the Luftwaffe forever. Let us step into the cockpit with a British test pilot at Boscombe Down in late 1942. The RAF has just received the P-47B for evaluation. The pilot, accustomed to the sensitive, twitchy controls of a Spitfire, climbs up, and it is a climb, into the cockpit of the Thunderbolt. He sits in a seat that feels like an armchair. The cockpit is so wide he can't touch the sides. He looks out over a nose that stretches forward like the deck of an aircraft carrier. He presses the starter. The inertial starter winds up with a whining groan like a dying animal. And then the R2800 catches. The vibration rattles his teeth. This isn't a machine you wear. It's a machine you ride. As he taxis out, he can't see anything forward. The nose is too high. He has to weave in S-turns just to see the runway. He lines up. He pushes the throttle forward. And the world blurs. The torque of the massive engine tries to twist the entire plane into the ground. He has to stomp on the rudder just to keep it straight. But then the tail lifts. And suddenly, this 7-ton beast is airborne. At altitude, he discovers the paradox. It climbs poorly. It turns like a truck. But when he points the nose down, God does it move. He discovers compressibility for the first time. In a dive, the controls freeze. The air becomes as hard as concrete. The shockwaves form on the wings. He is riding a meteorite. He lands, shaken, sweaty, and deafened. He writes in his report, "It is a dinosaur, but it is a dinosaur with good proportions." He doesn't know it yet, but he has just flown the plane that will clear the path for D-Day. The sound that would eventually haunt the German army wasn't an accident. It was physics. In early 1943, the P-47 was already loud. Its 2,000 horsepower engine was the most powerful of its time. But the true acoustical warfare began with a specific upgrade in early 1944. The paddle blade propeller. Standard propellers were thin and tapered, designed to slice through the air efficiently. But as the P-47's engine power increased, standard blades couldn't bite enough air to transfer that power into thrust. The energy was being wasted. The solution was the paddle blade, a massive 13-foot diameter propeller with broad, square-tipped blades that looked like oars. These massive blades bit into the air with terrifying force, but they created a side effect. Because the propeller was so wide, the tips of the blades had to travel a tremendous distance with every rotation. At full power, those tips were moving faster than the speed of sound. This created a continuous sonic boom, a supersonic shockwave that radiated outward from the aircraft for miles. It changed the sound of the Thunderbolt entirely. It was no longer just an engine noise. It was a Donnerschlag, a thunderclap. It was a deep, metallic, tearing sound, a threatening rumble that vibrated in the chest of anyone standing on the ground. Unlike the high-pitched whine of a German Messerschmitt or the drone of a British Spitfire, the P-47 sounded like the sky itself was tearing open. For the first time in the air war, a plane could be identified by its sound alone, long before it was visible to the naked eye. And for the German soldier hiding in the hedgerows of France, that sound became the trigger for a new kind of psychological trauma. To appreciate the German reaction to the P-47, we have to look back at their own history. The German Luftwaffe had invented acoustical warfare. In 1939, they attached Jericho trumpets, wind-driven sirens, to their Stuka dive bombers. The sirens served no aerodynamic purpose. Their only function was to scream. They were designed to terrify Polish and French troops, to break their morale before the bombs even landed. The Germans knew that fear was a weapon as potent as shrapnel. For 3 years, the German soldier walked with the swagger of a man whose air force owned the soundscape of Europe. They were the predators. By 1944, the tables had turned. The predator had become the prey, and the prey was suffering from a condition their doctors called Jabbo fever. Jabbo was short for Jag bomber, fighter bomber, and the king of the Jabbos was the P-47. German veterans who had endured the freezing hell of the Russian front and the artillery barrages of World War I found themselves breaking down because of a sound. Oberst Hans von Luck, a commander of a Panzer Grenadier regiment, described the experience. It wasn't just the bombs. It was the sound that preceded them. He noted, the sound was terrifying. engines roaring, rockets screaming. The supersonic roar of the paddle blades meant the aircraft was diving. It meant it was building speed for an attack run. When a German soldier heard that distinctive tearing metallic scream, he knew he had roughly 3 seconds to find a hole in the ground. But the acoustical terror didn't stop with the engine. It was the guns. The P-47 carried 850 caliber machine guns. When fired together, they didn't sound like the rat-a-tat-tat of a machine gun. They fired so rapidly, 6,000 rounds per minute combined, that the sound merged into a single, continuous tearing canvas noise. German pilots called it a solid stream. On the ground, it sounded like a jackhammer the size of a building. General Adolf Galland, the former head of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, later gave this sound a name. He called the P-47's battery Roosevelt's piano because of the sound they made. Not because it played music, but because once you heard that song, you never forgot it. "We laughed when we first saw them," one German pilot confessed in an interrogation. Fat, ugly American fighters. But the laughter died when they realized what those guns could do. "When you hear those guns," he said, "you know death has come calling. The sound haunts us." Normandy, July 1944. The Bocage country. High hedgerows that turn every field into a fortress. A German tank crew is parked in a sunken lane. They are the masters of the ground war. Their 88mm gun can destroy any Allied tank from a mile away. They are invincible, except for the sound. The commander stands in the turret, listening. The air is still. Then a low rumble begins in the west. It's not the sharp crack of artillery. It's the thunderclap. He doesn't look for enemy tanks. He looks for jabos. He spots 4 dots in the sky. They are P-47s laden with rockets and bombs. They are circling like vultures. The commander drops into the turret and buttons the hatch. "Panzer, march!" he screams. But where can they go? The P-47s roll in. The lead plane drops its nose. The Donnerschlag roar builds to a crescendo. The German crew hears the terrifying whoosh of 5-inch HVAR rockets leaving the rails. These rockets are the equivalent of a 105mm artillery shell. They don't just dent the tank, they crack it open. The first rocket hits the track. The tank slews sideways. The second hits the engine deck. Inside the steel beast, the sound is magnified. The hammer blows of the 50 caliber machine guns on the hull sound like hail on a tin roof, but hail that punches through the engine grating and ignites the fuel. The crew bails out into a hail of machine gun fire. The invincible tank is a burning wreck, and the P-47s climb back into the sun, their roar fading, leaving only the crackle of burning gasoline. This was the reality of the ground war, heavy metal rendered useless by acoustical terror from above. The sound of the P-47 was terrifying not just because it was loud, but because of what that loudness represented. To a German soldier scraping by on dwindling rations and horse-drawn supplies, the roar of the P-47 was the sound of infinite industry. It was the sound of an engine, the R2800, that was more complex than anything German industry could mass produce. It contained 2,400 individual components machined to tolerances of 1,000th of an inch. And yet, the Americans were building them by the thousands. Joseph Priller, the German ace who had once mocked the P-47 as a pregnant cow, eventually realized the grim truth hidden in that engine noise. "It's about overwhelming material superiority," Priller admitted. "They lose 10. They build 20. We have nothing but courage. And courage without resources is just delayed defeat." Every time a P-47 roared over a German column, it was a reminder that across the Atlantic factories were running 24 hours a day, turning out these monsters. The sound was the audible proof that Germany had picked a fight with a nation that could turn industrial production into a weapon of war. The sound was demoralizing because it was relentless. By late 1944, the 9th Air Force alone was flying over 213,000 sorties. The sky was never silent. The Donnerschlag was the background noise of the German retreat. Back in England, the British scepticism was turning into a different kind of emotion: disbelief. The RAF had spent years building fighters that were light, agile, and fragile. A Spitfire could be brought down by a few well-placed hits to its cooling system. Then they watched Robert S. Johnson land his Thunderbolt at Manston. It was June 26, 1943. Johnson's plane had been trapped by Focke-Wulfs. He had taken 21 cannon shells and over 200 machine gun bullets. He had been used for target practice by a German ace who eventually flew alongside him, shook his head, and saluted because the plane simply refused to fall. When Johnson taxied in, British crews gathered around the wreck. They counted the holes. They saw the shattered canopy, the severed control cables, the structural longerons shot through. To the British engineering mind, this aircraft should be a pile of smoking aluminum in the French countryside, but the flying milk bottle sat there on the runway, ruined but whole. It forced a shift in the Allied perspective. The British realized that the Americans hadn't built a bad fighter. They had built a different kind of fighter. The British built fighters to win duels. The Americans built fighters to survive a war of attrition. They built a machine that could take punishment that would vaporize a Spitfire and still bring the pilot home. The sound of the P-47 returning to base, sputtering, hole-ridden, but returning, became a sound of comfort to the bomber crews they escorted. General Adolf Galland, the ace of aces, was a man of style. He smoked cigars, wore custom suits, and flew the best fighters Germany had. He believed in the superiority of the German pilot. But in late 1944, he witnessed a raid that shook his world view. He was observing a formation of B-17 bombers. He expected the American escorts to turn back as their fuel ran low. That was the rule of air war. Fighters have short legs. But the P-47s didn't turn back. They stayed. They had drop tanks, belly tanks carrying 75 gallons of extra fuel. They loitered over Germany for hours. Galland watched as his Me-109s tried to attack the bombers, only to be bounced by P-47s that should have been back in England hours ago. He later said, "The Americans don't understand air combat. They built a bomber and called it a fighter." But he realized the mistake was his. The P-47 wasn't a fighter in the European sense. It was an air superiority platform. It was a flying gas station with guns. He watched a P-47 absorb damage that would have destroyed 3 Me-109s. He watched it keep flying, and he realized that the gentleman's war he loved was dead. It had been replaced by the war of the factory, the war of the thunderclap. For the Luftwaffe pilots, the acoustical nightmare was different. It was the sound of physics betraying them. In 1943, they had enjoyed the high ground. Their engines performed well, but as the P-47s evolved, the sound of the battle shifted to altitudes where the Germans couldn't breathe. The P-47's turbo supercharger allowed it to scream at full power at 30,000 feet. The German BMW 801 engines, gasping for air in the thin atmosphere, grew sluggish and quiet. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, a legend with 206 victories, heard the sound of his own obsolescence on October 8, 1943. At 28,000 feet, his Focke-Wulf was struggling. Above him, he heard the roar of P-47s diving. In the thin air, the Thunderbolt was a predator. Philipp didn't survive the encounter. The death of aces like Philipp sent a chill through the Luftwaffe mess halls. If the old hares, the veterans, couldn't survive the acoustical onslaught of the Thunderbolts, what chance did the new recruits have? By 1945, the situation was pathetic. Young German pilots like Klaus Brettschneider, with barely any training, were thrown into the sky. Brettschneider described his encounter with the P-47s as lasting only 12 seconds. He saw them dive. He heard the roar, and then his aircraft shook like it was hit by sledgehammers. The German pilots weren't just fighting an enemy, they were fighting a force of nature, a force that sounded like hammers from heaven. Even when Germany introduced the jet engine, the quiet whistling Me-262, the roar of the Thunderbolt could not be escaped. The P-47M, the sprint version, was designed to chase these jets. It used water methanol injection to boost the engine to 2,800 horsepower. Imagine the scene. A German jet pilot, flying the most advanced aircraft in history, looks back and sees a propeller-driven dinosaur diving at him at 500 miles per hour. Major George Bostwick noted that while the jets were faster, they were fragile. One good burst from our battery, and they come apart like they're made of paper. The roar of the piston engine, pushed to its absolute physical limit, was chasing down the future. And it was winning. Let us not forget the men on the ground whose job it was to shoot these monsters down. The flak crews. An 88mm flak battery near the Rhine, 1945. They are used to shooting at slow-moving bomber formations. It is a mathematical exercise. Compute speed, altitude, fuse setting, fire. But the P-47s don't fly straight. They come in at treetop level, moving at 400 miles per hour. The flak gunners try to track them. The gears of the heavy gun grind. But the turret can't traverse fast enough. The P-47 is a blur. And then the P-47 turns toward the gun. Usually ground shoots at air, but the P-47 is a flying tank. It challenges the gun. The pilot dips his wing. The 8 guns sparkle. The flak crew is engulfed in dirt and shrapnel. The solid stream of lead tears through the sandbags, through the gun shield, through the men. In seconds, the battery is silenced. The P-47 pulls up, its paddle blade prop screaming its victory song. The German gunners learn the hard way. You do not make eye contact with a Thunderbolt. Today, the P-47 Thunderbolt sits in museums, silent. It is a massive, heavy piece of metal that looks, to the modern eye, almost clumsy compared to the sleek jets that followed. But if you look closely at the display cases, you will find the echoes of the acoustical war. You will see the strips of gun camera film showing Focke-Wulfs disintegrating. You will see the spent brass casings of the .50 caliber rounds that rained down on Europe by the millions. And you will find quotes from the men who heard it. Men like the captured German pilot who said, "The laughter died with our comrades." The P-47 was a triumph of American engineering, yes, but its true legacy was in the noise it made. It was the sound of a Donnerschlag that announced the end of the Third Reich. It was the sound of a propeller blade biting into the air so hard it broke the sound barrier. It was the sound of Roosevelt's piano playing the funeral march of the Luftwaffe. For the British, it was the sound of a rude, loud industrial friend who had come to save the day. For the Germans, it was the sound of the inevitable. The thunder had spoken.